You don't think about time when you're winning at life. At least not the way I thought I was winning. Because to me, winning meant showing up, closing deals, keeping the schedule tight, and never letting anybody see me sweat. And that's why it felt so insulting when my own hand refused to cooperate over something as simple as a hotel keycard. It was a work conference in Phoenix, one of those beige, air-conditioned hotels where every hallway smells faintly like carpet shampoo and someone else's cologne. And I remember standing outside my room with a lanyard still hanging from my neck, the plastic badge tapping softly against my chest. And I remember thinking about tomorrow's morning meeting like it was the only thing in the universe that mattered. Then my fingers went stupid, like they belonged to somebody who'd been asleep for hours, and the keycard slid against the lock in this slow, clumsy way that made my stomach tighten with annoyance first, not fear, because my first instinct was always control, always irritation. Always, come on, get it together. I tried to laugh it off, like I'd just fumbled it, but my mouth didn't shape the laugh the way I told it to, and the hallway tilted a few degrees to the left, and it was the smallest tilt, the kind you could blame on fatigue, except my brain suddenly went cold with the certainty that this wasn't normal tired. Just picture it for a moment. Bright hotel lights, dead quiet except a distant ice machine humming, and you realizing you can't trust your own body to do something you've done 1,000 times. I leaned my shoulder into the wall, and when I tried to call for help, the words came out thick, like my tongue had turned into a heavy piece of cloth. And the worst part wasn't the fear yet. The worst part was the humiliation, because even then, even in that moment, I was still the kind of man who didn't want anyone to see him fall. Before that hallway, before the ambulance lights and the hospital smell, and the way time started coming at me in chopped up pieces, my life looked exactly like the kind of life people nod at when you describe it, like it makes sense on paper, like you did everything right. I was 52, a sales manager based in Arizona, and I had built myself into a machine that could tolerate pressure the way some people tolerate heat, because I'd trained my mind to believe stress meant importance, and importance meant safety, and safety meant I was doing my job as a husband and father, even if the way I did it slowly sanded down the softer parts of me. Our house was clean, our mortgage was paid, our vacations went on social media with the right angles and the right smiles. And if you stood in my kitchen on an ordinary evening, you'd see the family photos on the refrigerator and the fruit bowl that my wife, Dana, kept refilling like it was a small act of faith, and you'd assume the quiet meant peace. But the quiet wasn't peace, not really, because Dana had been getting quieter for years in a way I refused to name, and I had called it low drama, like it was a compliment I'd earned, when the truth was that she'd learned talking to me often turned into a debate, or a correction, or me going into problem-solving mode so aggressively that she'd end up feeling like she'd handed her emotions to a man who wanted to grade them. Our son, Tyler, was grown and living a few states away, and our relationship had shrunk into short calls and shorter texts. And I blamed his age, his independence, his busy life, anything except the obvious possibility that he didn't feel pulled toward me the way a son should, because I hadn't exactly made warmth easy to approach. I had a way of coming home and turning my body toward my phone like it was the real person in the room, and Dana would be at the stove, moving quietly, and I'd ask about dinner like it was a transaction, and when she tried to tell me about her day, I'd half listen with my eyes on a screen, and I'd act like being physically present was the same thing as being there. Have you ever convinced yourself you were doing fine just because no one was yelling at you, because there were no slammed doors, because the house stayed calm, even though the calm was actually someone else giving up? That was the kind of fine I was living in, and the thing that makes me swallow hard now is realizing I didn't even notice how much Dana was carrying until my body finally forced me to stop pretending I was unbreakable. If I'm honest, the stroke didn't come out of nowhere, not really, because my body had been sending me small, polite warnings for months, and I treated them the way I treated most inconveniences, like they were interruptions I could outwork. It started with headaches that felt like a tight band behind my eyes, the kind that showed up late afternoon when I'd already burned through 2 cups of coffee and a morning of calls, and I told myself it was screens, or stress, or dehydration, because those explanations let me keep moving without changing anything. There were mornings my fingers felt numb for a few seconds, like the nerves had been pinched in my sleep, and I'd shake my hand out and keep brushing my teeth, because the idea of listening to my body felt too close to admitting I wasn't in charge. The dizziness came in brief flashes, not dramatic, just enough to make the room feel like it had shifted when I stood up too fast, and I'd pause with my palm on the counter, waiting for the world to behave again, and then I'd keep going, because I had trained myself to believe pushing through was a virtue. Dana noticed long before I admitted anything out loud. "You've been getting headaches a lot," she said one night while she rinsed dishes, her voice careful in that way it had become, like she was approaching a man who might turn concern into criticism. "Maybe you should get checked." I remember the way I answered, and I hate it now because I can hear how dismissive I sounded even if I didn't raise my voice. "It's just work," I told her. "It's nothing." And she didn't argue, which is the part that should have scared me, because old Dana would have pushed, old Dana would have insisted. But this Dana just nodded like she'd filed my refusal away in a drawer full of other refusals. There were other things, too, not just physical. I'd been snapping faster, like my patience had thinned to a thread, and the smallest things would irritate me. Tyler taking too long to text back, Dana forgetting to pick up something at the store, a colleague missing a detail on a report. And the truth is I wasn't actually angry at them. I was angry at the feeling that life was constantly trying to slow me down. Looking back, that was fear wearing the mask of control. Because some part of me already suspected something was wrong, and I didn't want to be the guy sitting in a doctor's office hearing words like risk and blood pressure and change your lifestyle. Because I didn't know who I was without the grind. My identity was built on being needed, being productive, being the reliable one. And the idea of being told to rest felt like being told to disappear. Just picture this for a second. Your body offering you a dozen chances to pay attention, and you treating every single one like a minor annoyance, because deep down you're more afraid of slowing down than you are of breaking. The week before the conference, I had a moment in my office where my right hand went clumsy while I was typing, and a word came out wrong when I tried to speak to a coworker, and I laughed it off like I'd just stumbled, like it was nothing. And I watched my coworker's eyes flicker with concern before he decided to let me keep my dignity. That night, Dana stood in the doorway while I changed into pajamas, and she said, "I don't want to lose you." I forced a smile, the kind I'd used in business meetings for years. "You're not going to," I said, like certainty was something you could buy with the right tone. But when she walked away, her shoulders looked heavy, and I didn't follow her. I didn't ask what she meant. And that's the part that still stings. Because the signs weren't just in my body, they were in the people who loved me, and I ignored those too. The morning of the conference started like every other work trip I'd ever taken, which is part of what made what happened feel so unreal, because my brain kept trying to classify it as normal, right up until it couldn't. I woke up before my alarm, checked email in the dim light of the hotel room, and felt that familiar pulse of urgency in my chest, the one that had driven my life for years. The one that told me if I stayed ahead of everything, nothing could touch me. I showered, buttoned my shirt, tightened my tie, and stared at myself in the mirror with the kind of stern approval I'd always given when I looked composed, like appearance was proof that I was fine. Downstairs, the conference room smelled like coffee and carpet and hotel air, and I did what I always did. I smiled, shook hands, made jokes that weren't really funny, and pushed through the day like a man on rails. There were moments where the headache tried to return, and I ignored it. There were moments where my fingers tingled slightly, and I flexed them under the table and kept talking. I gave a presentation mid-afternoon and felt that small, strange lag between thought and speech, like my words were arriving a fraction late. And I told myself it was nerves, even though I wasn't nervous. That's the thing about denial. It's not a dramatic lie. It's 1,000 small edits you make to reality, so you can keep living the version of yourself you're used to. By evening, the conference had spilled into that social hour people pretend is relaxed, but is really just networking in softer lighting. And I stood with a plastic cup of something I didn't even want, smiling at people I barely knew, and I felt tired in a way that went deeper than the day, like the bones of me were exhausted. I remember thinking about Dana then, not in a warm way, but in a practical way, how I should call her, how I should check in, except I didn't, because I wanted 10 minutes of quiet first, like she was another obligation I had to manage. When I finally left and rode the elevator up, the hallway on my floor was quiet. Almost too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your footsteps sound louder than they should. The lights were bright and flat, and the air was cool, and I remember the small details with painful clarity, the pattern in the carpet, the faint whir of an ice machine down the hall, the way my badge swung gently as I walked. I reached my door and pulled the keycard from my wallet. And that's where my body turned on me. My right hand didn't obey the way it always had. It wasn't pain, it was something worse, because it felt like betrayal. The card slipped. My fingers fumbled. I tried again, and my wrist didn't rotate smoothly, like the connection between my intention and my muscles had been cut. My first reaction was anger, because that was my reflex, because in my mind nothing was allowed to malfunction. "Come on," I muttered, and the words sounded wrong. Thick, rounded, like my mouth had forgotten how to form them. That's when the fear arrived. Not a soft worry, not a vague sense of something off, but a sharp, immediate terror that made the skin on my arms tighten, because my brain finally stopped negotiating and started shouting. I tried to say help, and it came out like a smear. The hallway tilted again, and my knees softened, and for a split second I thought, absurdly, about how embarrassing it would be to be found collapsed outside a hotel room like some drunk businessman who couldn't handle himself. That's the kind of man I was, more worried about optics than reality, even while my reality was breaking. I leaned my shoulder against the wall and tried to steady my breathing, but my breath came shallow, and the air felt heavy going in, like the hallway itself had thickened. My phone was in my left hand, and my thumb moved clumsily as I tried to unlock it, and the screen blurred because my eyes couldn't focus the way they should. Have you ever had a moment where you realize you're not the one driving anymore? Where something inside you takes the wheel and you're just strapped in, helpless, watching it happen? I slid down the wall because standing felt impossible, and I remember the carpet against my palm, rough and strangely warm, and I remember the taste of panic in my mouth, metallic and dry. Somewhere down the hall, a door opened. I heard footsteps. A voice, female, I think, said, "Sir, are you okay?" I tried to answer. I tried to say, "Stroke," because some part of my brain recognized it even then. But what came out was a sound that wasn't language, and the shame of that hit me so hard I wanted to disappear into the floor. The woman stepped closer, her shoes clicking, and I saw her face bend toward me in the bright light, her expression shifting from confusion to alarm. "Oh my God," she said, and her voice sharpened. "Can you squeeze my hand?" I tried. My right hand didn't do what I asked it to do. She was already pulling out her phone, speaking quickly, the way people do when fear turns them efficient. "I need an ambulance," she said. "He can't talk right. He's not moving his arm." Time did something strange then, because part of it sped up and part of it slowed down. The minutes between the call and the sirens felt endless, yet the moment the paramedics arrived it became a blur of clipped questions and practiced motion. They knelt beside me, their uniforms crisp, their voices calm in a way that made my panic feel childish. "Sir, can you tell me your name?" I knew my name. I could see it in my head like it was printed on paper. But when I tried to send it out through my mouth, it got stuck. "Okay," one of them said gently, and I could hear the urgency under the gentleness. "We've got you. We're going to take care of you." Cold for tape tugged at my skin. A blood pressure cuff squeezed my arm. Someone shone a light in my eyes. The hallway ceiling lights slid past above me as they lifted me onto the stretcher, and for a second I caught sight of my hotel door, the keycard still on the carpet near my shoe, like a stupid little symbol of everything I couldn't control anymore. In the elevator, one paramedic leaned close and spoke directly into my ear. "Listen to me," he said. "If you can't hear me, blink twice." I blinked twice, hard, like I was trying to stay anchored to the world. He nodded, and I heard him say to his partner, "Possible stroke. We're in the window." That phrase, "in the window," lodged in my head like a hook, because suddenly it wasn't just about fear, it was about time, and I had spent my whole life acting like time belonged to me. Now it felt like it was being measured in seconds. The ambulance ride was lights and motion and the high, distant wail that sounded like it was happening to somebody else. The ceiling of the ambulance was too close. The air smelled like clean plastic and antiseptic, and every bump in the road reminded me I was real and fragile and completely out of my depth. And somewhere in that ride, as the paramedics spoke in medical shorthand over my body, I thought about Dana for the first time that day in a way that wasn't practical. I thought about her answering a call. I thought about her hearing the words I'd been too stubborn to hear. And I realized, with a cold clarity that made my throat tighten, that I might not get to choose how this story ended. The strangest thing about losing control of your body is that your mind doesn't necessarily go with it, at least not all at once, because for a while I was still there, still listening, still understanding in fragments, like life had been turned down to a muffled channel and someone had put a wall between me and my own voice. I remember ceilings, ambulance ceiling, hospital ceiling, different shades of white that all felt too bright, and I remember the sensation of motion without agency, like my body was luggage being carried through a world that suddenly spoke a language I couldn't answer in. I could hear words, but they came in pieces, and my brain had to work too hard to connect them, like trying to read a sentence with half the letters missing. Stroke. Time window. Right side weakness. CT. The words were clinical, efficient, and the people saying them moved like they'd done this 1,000 times, and that was terrifying, because it meant my emergency wasn't special to them, even though it was the most singular thing that had ever happened to me. There was a moment, maybe in a hallway, maybe in an imaging room, where the cold of a table pressed through my clothes and into my skin, and I remember wanting to shiver but not being able to, and I remember the sound of a machine humming like a low insect drone. Someone told me to stay still. I wanted to say, I'm trying, but the sentence never made it past my teeth. And while all of that was happening, my mind started doing something I can only describe now as panic saving, like a computer frantically backing up the files that matter most before the power cuts out. Images came without warning. Dana standing at the sink, shoulders slightly hunched, rinsing a plate that didn't need rinsing because it gave her something to do while I sat behind her on the couch, half listening, eyes locked on my phone. Tyler at 17, tall and awkward, leaning against the kitchen counter, telling me about something that mattered to him, and me cutting in with advice before he'd even finished because I didn't know how to just hear him without trying to fix him. Dana sitting at the edge of our bed with her hands folded, asking, "Are you happy?" And me answering like it was a trick question, like happiness was something you earned later, after you got through the next quarter, the next deal, the next goal. Have you ever had your brain show you the exact moments you've been avoiding, like it's holding them up under a light and saying, "Look, this is what you did. This is what you missed." Because that's what it felt like, and it wasn't dramatic, it wasn't cinematic in the movie sense, it was brutally ordinary, and that was what made it hurt. I wasn't seeing grand tragedies. I was seeing small choices repeated 1,000 times until they became a life. There were sounds too, voices drifting in and out, shoes squeaking on hospital floors, a nurse saying something reassuring that I couldn't hold on to long enough to be reassured. I caught my own name once, spoken by someone I couldn't see, and it hit me like a hand on the chest, because hearing your name in that tone, urgent, careful, makes you realize you're no longer the narrator of your own day. And then, somewhere in that blur, I heard Dana. Not her voice at first, not words, just the presence of her, like the air changed, like the space around me tightened with something familiar. I heard someone say, "Your wife is here," and the sentence landed in me like a bell. Try to put yourself in that moment with me, because this is hard to explain unless you imagine it. You're trapped behind your own face, you can't lift your hand, you can't speak, and the person who has been quietly living beside you for years suddenly arrives at the edge of your existence. I heard her try to sound steady, the way she always did in public, the way she did when she didn't want to create a scene. I heard her say, "Hi, I'm his wife," and her voice was controlled, but thin at the edges, like a thread stretched too tight. Then I heard a doctor speaking to her in that careful tone doctors use when they're trying to be honest without being cruel, and I couldn't catch every word, but I caught enough to feel the meaning. "Serious. I see you. Next hours." And Dana didn't cry right away, which is what broke me, because Dana had been holding things in for so long that even fear had to wait its turn. But later I heard it. It wasn't right beside me. It was through a wall, or through a door, or maybe just through the fog of my own mind. But I heard the sound of her finally cracking somewhere in the hallway, and it wasn't loud. It wasn't theatrical. It was the kind of cry someone makes when they've been trying to be strong for so long that when the strength slips, it slips all at once. That sound haunted me more than the monitors, more than the word stroke, more than the knowledge that my body was failing. Because in that sound I heard something I had refused to face for years. Dana had been carrying me, carrying our home, carrying the emotional weight of being married to a man who thought providing was the same thing as loving. I wanted to call her name. I wanted to tell her I was sorry. I wanted to tell her I could hear her, that she wasn't alone, that I finally understood. But I couldn't. And that helplessness did something to me that no argument and no warning and no lecture ever had. It stripped me down to the simplest truth. If I didn't come back from this, my last contribution to her life would be exhaustion. If I did come back, I couldn't keep living like time was an unlimited resource and love was something people should just know without being shown. Just picture this, too. The person you love crying on the other side of a door, and you being unable to reach for them, unable to speak, unable to undo a decade of distance with a single sentence. That's where I was, stuck in a body that had finally forced my pride to sit down, while my mind replayed every moment I'd treated connection like an optional luxury. And somewhere deep inside that trapped silence, a thought formed with a clarity that felt almost sharp. If I get another morning, I'm not spending it the way I used to. When I came back to myself, it wasn't like waking up from sleep, because sleep has softness to it, and this was harsher, like surfacing through thick water into light that was too bright and air that felt too thin. My eyes opened and immediately wanted to close again, not from tiredness but from overload, because the ICU is a place built out of sounds and alerts and fluorescent honesty, and I could hear a monitor beeping in a steady rhythm that made my heart feel like it had been turned into data. My mouth was dry in a way I didn't know was possible, like my tongue was made of cotton, and when I tried to swallow, my throat protested. I tried to move, and my body answered unevenly. My left side responded first, fingers twitching, a shoulder shifting slightly, while my right side felt like a weight that belonged to someone else. The difference between those two halves of me was terrifying, because it made my body feel unfamiliar, like I'd been split down the middle and stitched back together wrong. There was a nurse nearby, her shoes quiet on the floor, her voice low and practiced. "Hey," she said, and she leaned into my line of sight like she didn't want to scare me. "Welcome back. You're in the ICU. You had a stroke. You're safe." Safe. That word sounded like something other people got. My eyes searched the room, slow and clumsy, and I saw tubes and wires and the edge of a curtain and a plastic cup on a counter, and everything felt too crisp, too real, like I'd been living in a blurry version of my life, and someone had suddenly turned the focus up. Then I saw Dana. She was sitting in the chair beside the bed, but not the way she used to sit at home with relaxed comfort, because nothing about her posture was relaxed. She was leaning forward slightly, elbows on her knees, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles looked pale, like she'd been holding herself together by force. Her hair wasn't styled the way it usually was. There were faint dark shadows under her eyes that made her look older than she had a week ago. And her face told me the truth before any doctor could, because there was relief there. Yes, a kind of stunned relief that I was awake, that I was still here, but layered under it was exhaustion so deep it looked like a second skin, and behind that exhaustion was something sharp and quiet. Not hatred, not cruelty, a kind of tired anger that said, "I have been alone in this for a long time." She didn't rush to smile like she was supposed to. She didn't perform optimism. She just stared at me, and her eyes looked wet but steady. And for a second it felt like we were seeing each other for the first time in years, not as husband and wife in a routine, but as two human beings confronted with the reality that one of them almost disappeared. I tried to say her name. I could feel it in my chest, the urge to anchor myself to her, to prove I was still me, to prove I was still connected. I opened my mouth and pushed air, and what came out wasn't her name. It was a strained, broken sound that didn't resemble language. The shame of it hit me so fast I felt my eyes sting, because I had built my life on being articulate, persuasive, confident, the man who could talk his way through any room, and now I couldn't even form the simplest word that mattered. Dana's expression flickered. Not disgust, not pity, something worse, recognition. She leaned forward, and her voice came out soft, almost careful. "I'm here," she said. "You don't have to, just breathe." And I wanted to tell her that hearing her cry in the hallway had split something open in me, but I couldn't. I wanted to tell her that I finally understood what I'd been doing to her, but I couldn't. I wanted to tell her that I was sorry in a way that wasn't performative, in a way that wasn't an apology meant to end a fight, but a real apology, the kind that admits you've been wrong for years. But my mouth wouldn't cooperate. Try to imagine that kind of frustration, having a life full of unsaid things, finally feeling them clearly, and then waking up unable to speak them. Dana reached out and rested her hand on my left forearm, her touch warm against my skin, and I felt how badly I had taken simple touch for granted, how many nights I'd sat 3 feet away from her and treated closeness like background noise. The nurse spoke again, gently explaining what they would do next, how I would work with therapists, how speech might come back slowly, how recovery would be a process, and I heard the words, but they didn't land as heavily as the silent conversation happening in Dana's eyes. Because the truth in her face wasn't just that I'd had a stroke. The truth was that she'd been preparing to lose me long before my body gave out, because the man I'd been living as was already half gone from her life. A tear slipped from the corner of her eye, and she brushed it away quickly like she was annoyed at herself for letting it show. I watched her do that, and it hit me with a strange clarity. I had spent years thinking Dana's quiet meant she didn't need much. Now I understood it meant she had learned not to ask. Recovery is not one dramatic moment where you decide to be better and then everything is fixed, because real recovery is humiliating in the small ways, and it forces you to face yourself in increments, like a long, honest conversation you can't escape. The first days blurred together, nurses checking vitals, therapists testing movement, doctors explaining things in terms that sounded too calm for what they meant. But the part that changed me happened in the quiet spaces, when the room settled, and I was left alone with the reality that my body didn't trust me anymore. Physical therapy started with things that would have seemed ridiculous to the old me. Lifting my right leg a few inches, trying to grip a foam ball with my right hand, sitting up without my balance collapsing. I remember how my face burned the first time a therapist had to steady my shoulder so I wouldn't tip over, because I had spent my adult life being the one people leaned on, and now I couldn't even sit like a normal man without help. Speech therapy was worse, not physically, but emotionally, because it turned my pride into dust. The therapist would show me pictures, simple objects, everyday things, and ask me to name them, and sometimes my brain knew exactly what they were while my mouth refused to cooperate, and I would feel frustration rise like heat in my chest. The old version of me would have snapped. The old version of me would have turned that frustration into blame or sarcasm. But there was nowhere for it to go, because in that room, frustration didn't make you stronger, it just made you tired. Dana came every day when she could. She didn't bring dramatic speeches or forced cheer. She brought small normal things, a clean t-shirt, my phone charger, a sandwich from the cafeteria that she knew I wouldn't eat much of but would appreciate anyway. And she brought her presence in a way that made me realize how rarely I had offered her mine. Some afternoons, she would sit and read quietly, and I'd watch her eyes move across the page, and I'd think about how many times she'd tried to talk to me while I stared at a screen, and I'd feel a heaviness in my chest that had nothing to do with the stroke. One day, a few weeks in, I managed to form her name. It wasn't smooth. It came out cracked, like a word spoken through gravel. Dana. The sound of it surprised both of us. Dana's head lifted so fast it was like a reflex, and her eyes widened, and for a second the exhaustion on her face broke open into something raw. She reached for my hand, my left hand, the one that still worked, and held it like she was afraid the moment would disappear. "I'm here," she whispered again, and I could hear how much she needed to believe it, too. Have you ever waited so long to say something simple that when you finally say it, it feels like it weighs 100 pounds? Because that's what it felt like, and it made me realize that words aren't just sounds, they're doors, and I had kept too many doors closed in my own home for too long. The next milestone was the word that mattered most. Sorry. It came out one morning when Dana was adjusting the blanket at my feet, doing that quiet caretaking thing she'd been doing for years, and I watched her hands that had packed my lunches, folded my shirts, steadied our life. And something inside me pushed forward, not as pride, not as control, but as honesty. "Sorry," I said, rough and slow. Dana froze. She didn't respond right away, and in that pause I understood something that hurt, because apologies don't erase history, and one word doesn't undo years of emotional absence. When she finally looked up, her eyes were glassy, but her voice stayed steady. "For what?" she asked. And that question was a gift and a challenge, because it meant she wasn't going to let me toss out a vague apology like a coin into a fountain and pretend the wish was granted. I swallowed, my throat working hard. I couldn't give her a long speech. I couldn't articulate everything yet, but I could choose precision. "For leaving you alone," I forced out, piece by piece. Dana's face tightened, and her lips trembled slightly, and she looked away as if she needed a second to keep herself from breaking. Then she said something that I still hear clearly. "I started preparing myself," she whispered. "Not for the stroke. For losing you anyway. Because you were here, but you weren't with me. Just picture that for a second. Your wife admitting she had emotionally rehearsed your absence while you were still breathing in the same house." That sentence hit harder than any medicine. I cried then, quietly, because even crying felt different after you've almost died, and I didn't want it to be about me, but I couldn't stop it. Dana didn't rush to comfort me. She just sat back down, and after a moment she placed her hand over mine again, not as forgiveness, not as resolution, but as a cautious sign that we were still standing on the same ground. Recovery at home was slow and unglamorous. There were exercises on the living room floor. There were appointments. There were days my right hand felt like it belonged to a stranger. There were moments I caught myself slipping back into impatience, and I had to stop, breathe, and choose a different response. But the biggest change wasn't physical. It was that I started noticing time like it was fragile. I stopped scrolling through dinner. I started asking Dana questions and waiting for the full answer instead of jumping in with solutions. When Tyler called, I didn't treat it like a quick update. I treated it like a window, and I stayed inside it as long as he would let me. Try to feel what I felt. This strange, humbling gratitude for ordinary things. The quiet clink of forks, the warmth of sunlight on the kitchen counter, the sound of Dana moving around the house without that defeated heaviness in her shoulders. I wasn't suddenly perfect, but I was finally awake. A few months after the stroke, I stood in my kitchen early one morning and made coffee the slow way, not because I had time to kill, but because I finally understood what time is, and I watched the steam rise like it was something worth noticing. The house was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than before, because it wasn't resignation, it was rest. Dana came in wearing an old t-shirt, hair still messy, and she didn't look like a woman bracing herself for another day of carrying a man who wouldn't meet her halfway. She looked tired, yes, because life is still life, but she looked present, and when she leaned against the counter and I reached for her hand, she didn't hesitate the way she used to. I think about that hotel hallway more than I want to, because it was the first time my body forced my ego to shut up, and it was the first time I heard, in the rawest way, what my absence had been doing to the people I love. The stroke didn't just scare me into gratitude, it cornered me into honesty. So if you're watching this and you recognize even a little of what I'm describing, if you've been calling silence peace, if you've been treating stress like a badge, if you've been assuming the people who love you will just keep standing there no matter how little you give them, just picture that moment where your body doesn't cooperate and you realize you don't get to negotiate for more time. Have you ever waited to say something kind because you thought there would be a better moment later? I thought there would always be later. Now I don't. If you still have the chance to say something gentle, to be present at the table, to ask a question and actually listen to the answer, don't leave it for someday. Being loved and having someone to love back might be the rarest thing we get in this life, and it's almost always sitting right in front of us, disguised as an ordinary morning.